Hi and welcome to the Nightfall Diaries. This is the third and final instalment for now. I've been filming these in the evenings when the video editor has been away at her sister's and I've had some time off work to recharge before Christmas. You probably won't see this until a good 10 days or so after it's filmed. It's very late November. It's been a beautiful sunny day, very, very cold, coldest day of the autumn so far here in Bath. And the sun has just gone down behind Salisbury Hill near my house, and that means it's only actually about 4 o'clock, but it's starting to get dark already, and we are definitely into that part now where the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, you know that thing. And I've often wondered what it's like to live at the equator where you don't get such variation in seasonality. That must be interesting. I must ask Matt at Bookpill what that's like, and maybe I'll go and see him one day down there and find out. So we'll see, I guess. So am I in a pensive mood again, the dark night of the soul? Yeah, I guess so. You know, it's been a busy day. I've sort of done some shopping, I've done some book hauling, and I've been sort of doing some video edits and what have you, but I've mostly been just doing that sort of thing. And this evening I'm going to take it easy. I don't know, I'm going to watch a film, I'm not sure what. But anyway, what are we talking about? We're talking about SF as ever. And as you see, I have my trusty JD here to look after me, so I'll be getting into that later on. So I'll show you some new things, and I'm going to do a book review. And what I'm going to talk about actually is fantasy and science fiction. And as Darko Suvin said, what is the pathological connection that's made between them? And, you know, instantly you can see why people think they're connected. And obviously, historically, the publishing has been connected. And as I've said before on the channel, that's a big problem. And as fantasy and SF separate further and further from each other, and this has been happening for a long time, you know, it seems increasingly daft that they still come out of the same publishing budgets, or that they're in the same section in bookshops. And back in the 1980s, I used to run an SF section, a very large bookshop, and I kept SF and fantasy separately, and it worked really, really well. And a friend of mine, when he took over, I went to become office based then. A friend of mine took over, he did some great work as well. And as well as sort of paperbacks, trade paperbacks, hardcovers, we did limited editions. We got sort of things like runs of Dennis Dobson books in, stuff like that. And it worked really well, you know. That was the late 80s. And I haven't really run an SF section as big since then. I am intermittently involved, but I do lots of things in my job, you know. So it's not always about the SF. But I do feel now that it is time the two things were separated as an industry standard. But why are they connected in the first place? Well, you know, obviously there's the pulp magazines when there were things like Weird Tales, and there was Astounding and Amazing, and often SF writers would write fantasy, but of course very often they write crime fiction as well. This is the thing. It's important to remember that a lot of these authors did other things. Even A. Van Vogt wrote a mainstream novel or two. You know, this is the thing. So if you look at the history of fiction, and I've mentioned this a number of times, I know, but I just wanted to go through it again. Initially, there was just story. People just told stories around the campfire, in the caves, what have you, as we sort of crawled our way out from the primal slime, as it were. And, you know, initially it was oral tradition. I mean, you think of Homer. Nobody knows who Homer was. He was just somebody who had these tales of Odysseus, Ulysses, and told them, and they were passed on, and they were probably embroidered and expanded. So Homer, the authorship of Homer, when it was finally written down, is nobody really knows. There's probably multiple authors that we know collectively as Homer, though no doubt there was an original Homer at some point. And of course, back then, people believed in magic, the supernatural, gods and demons, what have you, as people still do today. But then, virtually everybody did. It was a given. So story initially, reality and fantasy were sort of inextricably mixed together, and people told stories. And if you look at things like Beowulf, if you look at cultures all over the world, there are fantastic, magical, superstitious, religious stories, and they're the oldest stories of all. So story was initially a combination of people telling tales. Look at the water buffalo I killed today, blaming or thanking the gods and so on. So the two things were mixed together. And it's only really in the run up to the Middle Ages when the Arthurian romances became a big thing. especially in France, and they were fundamentally based on legends which came from Wales and England, and all the evidence, what little evidence there is, suggests that Arthur was a sort of post-Roman occupation chieftain, you know, round about the sort of 5th or 6th century. And Merlin, you know, was a Welsh bard, a wizard. So that started to be written down. The French especially embroidered those things. They brought in the Christian symbols of the Holy Grail and what have you. So we saw the sort of beginnings of fantasy writing, the chivalric thing, in that, leading up to Don Quixote, you know, which was the first book from the Spanish picaresque tradition that sort of lampooned that sort of thing, and was about a fantasy reader, Don Quixote, who couldn't separate his reading from reality. So, you know, so that was fantasy. And then, of course, realism became a thing with the birth of the novel proper, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and the focus of people like Samuel Richardson, Jane Austen, a lot of the early novelists, on the sort of soap opera detail of people's lives was a new thing. It was like a novum in itself. And even though there's lots of things which are proto-SF, and there's loads and loads and loads of them, things which appear to be scientific about science, we can't really talk about SF in any meaningful way until we actually have the scientific method, the Enlightenment, the age of reason, repeated experimentation and all that sort of thing, and it ties in the Industrial Revolution. And I've said all this, I know, time and time again. So really, looking chronologically, story comes first. Out of story, you begin to get a separation of fantasy and realism. You get the flowering of realistic narratives, and then you get science fiction coming out of the scientific method. And I really think it should be called science fiction, because what it does, even if you're talking about imaginary science, what the author is doing is they're laying out their cards on the table, and they're saying science is the thing. Science is the methodology and the means by which we try and explain our world. And this is what Aldous wrote about in his history of SF. You know, it's an attempt to understand in our confused state, in a post-Gothic mode, how we make sense of the universe. And we use science. We don't use hard science, physics, maths, chemistry, biology. We also use the soft sciences of philosophy, sociology, psychology, and so on. So, you know, it really is about having a rationalist approach. So even when a writer writes about something that probably isn't scientifically possible, if they use a scientific underpinning, or they make an excuse of their use of the novum as being scientific rather than magical, then we've got SF. So really, fantasy and science fiction are separated in the middle by realism in chronological terms. And that's why I think science fiction has more to do with realism than it does with fantasy, when you start to think about it that way philosophically and historically. So that's something for you to think about. It'd be interesting to see what you think about that. And I guess we'll sort of do a bit of a book haul thing, because that's been part of these things. And I'll do some more next time the video bit as well. I'll just move the whiskey a minute, because we're not going to sip it yet, because it's a little bit too early. As I say, the sun's just gone down. And I decided to do this in this light because the picture quality hasn't been so great on the others. And it's also, I'm in the mood as well. So what have I got recently? Well, I've got a few things today and the last 2 days, so I'll show them to you now. But we're going to begin with a book review. And I think in the previous episode, or a previous episode of these Nightfall Diaries, I showed you this, Joe Lane, Where Furnaces Burn. And I finished this a couple of days ago. And, you know, shall I give it a mark? You know, should we do that rating thing? I don't normally do that. I would give it a 3.5 out of 5, or maybe a 6 to 7 out of 10 if I was going to do that sort of thing. And I never do that sort of thing, so I'm obviously in a strange mode. Nice book, Influx Press, done a beautiful job actually. You'd think this is from a bigger publisher. They've spent the money, good for them. And Joel Lane was born in the same sort of year as me, and he died at the age of 50 in 2013, and he won the World Fantasy Award for this. And this is a short story collection. In a way, it's also a fix-up. How I would describe it is as a collection of vignettes. They're short stories. Some of them are pretty short. Some of them, quite a few of them, don't have conventional endings in any way. And they have one common character. It's about a policeman in the Black Country, the West Midlands, which is Birmingham and its environs. And as I said in the other video, if you don't know the UK, Birmingham's quite an industrial place. The people have a very distinctive accent, the Brummie accent, which is instantly recognisable. It's a place which has become increasingly multi-ethnic over the last 30-40 years. There's a lot of people who originated in the Indian subcontinent there, and you really notice that when you go there. I haven't been there for many years. I actually want to go to Birmingham because the biggest record shop in the UK is there, and I haven't been for, it must be, let's see, it's at least 15 years. I used to go with work occasionally. I've been for a long time, but it is an industrial place, and this is a big backdrop of that. And it's about a policeman, and we see him early in his career, and he joins the police force, and it's a first person narrative. And the main problem with this is there are 23 of these vignettes or short stories in here, and the book is, let's see, 272 pages long. He wrote 2 novels. I do want to read a novel by him because I'll see how he tackles it, because part of the problem with this is, even though a lot of the individual stories are really good, and most of them are good, 23 is just too many unless you love this kind of writing. How would I describe it? Weird fiction. It's one of those things that gets bandied about. And I would say that weird fiction, it's obviously applied to Lovecraft. Lovecraft used to use it, and we think of that as horror fiction. I actually think that Lovecraft is a science fiction writer, and I'll talk about that in another video. But he was very much bringing this melange of the supernatural, of science, and he also wrote straight fantasy as well early on, Dunsany infected things, if you want to put it that way. And weird fiction has come to be used as something where people are writing a kind of horror, but it's not essentially exploitive horror. It's atmospheric. It's often about place and time, and it has the inflection of modernism as well. And it also has elements of psychogeography and landscape writing and nature writing, those sort of things. And as I say, a friend of mine said he heard this was compared to M. John Harrison. I was thinking it would be more like Nicholas Royle. What I would say is that Joe Lane was not as good a writer as M. John Harrison by a long chalk, and not as good a writer as Nicholas Royle by a long chalk. But this is still worth reading. But the problem was there's too much of it. If this had been 200 pages, then I think it would have been great. But the problem is he wrote all these different stories. They do form a kind of narrative, and because they're short, it's not like, say, reading one of Keith Roberts' episodic novels like Pavan or Chalk Giants, where the chunks are quite big. These are short. So are they formulaic? To a degree, yes. In other ways, no. Some of them don't have any actual endings or denouements. And that reminded me of the stories of Dino Buzzati, which are collected in the book Catastrophe, which are very surreal stories, and they end very abruptly without resolution. And some of these are not resolved. And this character, you see him beginning his relationship with his wife. They have a child, and you see their family develop over a period of about 20 years, and that's quietly in the background. But he goes around different parts of the West Midlands, and if you know the places, then it must be fantastic. I don't really know them. I've looked at some pictures to get a feel and what have you, but he's not a very descriptive writer in that he mentions things and he populates his landscape with things like smashed Victorian urinals, railway bridges are a big thing, all sorts of elements which pop up time and time again. And he paints a picture of a grim, dirty, industrialised place, which is what I instantly think of with Birmingham. So if you're from that part of the country, I do apologise, but it does have that sort of milieu and feel about it, and I'm sure some parts of it are really good, and he sets it around this. So if you live in that area, then it must be a fantastic read to see whether you agree with it. And there's an introduction by somebody who is from that area, and when they read Joe Lane, they thought, God, I always thought there was nothing happening around here when I was growing up and I was a young dweeb, and now I realise the weird and the fantastic is everywhere, and this book helped me see that. And this policeman, he encounters strange cases. There's lots of talks of glassing, of gang murders, of lots of conventional crimes, child abuse, all sorts of things. So there's elements of police procedural, but more often not, the uncanny and the strange, and maybe the supernatural or the science fictional comes into these stories. Sometimes these things are resolved, sometimes they're not. There's murder cases, thefts, blackmail, all kinds of things. And we see this unfolding. But as I say, because he's not a particularly descriptive writer in the way that, say, M. John or Nicholas Royle is, it doesn't quite come off in the same way. In a way, it has more of the feeling of somebody like Ted Lewis, the crime writer who wrote Get Carter, or Derek Raymond who wrote the Factory novels. It has more of that feel. So it combines police procedural with sort of weird fiction, horror, what have you. And some of it is utterly unrealistic. You know that there's something bizarre going on. It also works on the level of symbolism, where you think what he's saying, the policeman is using these things as metaphors, and he maybe has taken it too far, and perhaps he has a mental illness, and that is subtly suggested in some of these stories, and maybe that's something I read into it myself. But of course, what you read into a story, that's part of the creative process as well, and every artist knows that, every writer knows that. It's when their mind and the reader's mind come together. And there's, this Rai sort of mentions, there's one bit a little way in, about 8 or 10 stories in, where he says, I was rapidly becoming known as the Fox Mulder of the area. But it's not a book which is trying to be like an urban fantasy, which is a relief. And the more I talk about it, the more I realise I enjoyed it more than I initially thought I did. But there was too much of it. I DNF'd 1 or 2 of the stories because the pace wasn't there. But there's purely because there's too much of it, and there aren't enough pauses for fine, reflective, descriptive writing. Now, I like descriptive writing, but you can have too much of a good thing. But nonetheless, this has a lot of chill in it, a lot of ebony darkness in it, a lot of, dark night of the soul, as I keep saying. So it is worth a look. I'm going to hang on to it, I think, and give it another go, another point. And I think if you just picked it up now and again, it's the sort of thing that if you read about 3 a night over a longer period, you probably enjoy more, and that's what I should have done. That's the methodology for reading this book, because the stories appeared in all sorts of magazines, anthologies and what have you. So most people who read them the first time around didn't read them in a sequence and didn't get the flow of the narrative about the character and his family. And the last story's good. There is a proper denouement, which leaves as many questions unanswered as it does answer things. And it's good. So yeah, maybe I'll up my rating a bit. So give it a try. I'm going to get one of his novels, and he wrote 2. I don't know about other short stories, but of course, as I say, this is a funny book because there's short stories in the same shade background, the same character. So it's arguably a fix-up novel. Joel Lane, Where Furnaces Burn. There you go. So that's a bit of weird fiction for you, which I don't do very often. And I don't read a lot of horror. I find it hard to engage with horror these days. I prefer the classic stuff. But I was chatting with Matt and Bookpill the other day on a sort of comments thing, and he said to me he felt there was more energy maybe in contemporary horror than there was in contemporary SF, and I'm sure he's probably right, because there are new things bubbling up all the time, so maybe I'll get back into it at some point. Anyway, what else do we have? Somebody who I haven't read for a very long time, and I read a book by him called Kronk a long time ago, and I read something else and I can't think what it was. This is a really long time ago. This has been in the early to mid-80s. It's Edmund Cooper, and this is Who Needs Men in Coronet. Very beautiful A format, as you can see. And Edmund Cooper used to do SF reviews, I think, for the Sunday Times. And I've always struggled to place him in British SF. Where is he? He's not exactly a new waver. He's not a hard science guy. He's not a full-blown social science guy. He wasn't a complete hack who sort of wrote third-rate things for Robert Hale, that sort of stuff. It's really hard to place him. And Coronet, Hodder and Stoughton, they got behind him for a long time. And this is Who Needs Men. And I'm quite interested in this because this book has quite a reputation and it sounds quite pulpy. But he made some quite sexist comments back in the day, about feminism and women. And he famously said something like, let's see if women can compete with men in all sorts of things. Let's see who comes out on top. And, the fact is we're complementary beings. We have different skills. And the whole idea of the human race is that, we can't do everything. One gender or sex, or whatever you want to call it, can't do everything. You have partnerships, you fall in love. And I wrote about this in 100 Must Read Books for Men. It's a complementary thing. So this is about a kind of feminist dystopia and killing of men. So I wanted to read that, and I like that title, Who Needs Men? So I do quite like things with a polemic or thrust. I mean, that's one of my things with political SF. I'm quite happy to read SF, which comes from a very different political point to my own, because I think it's important to do so, because politics is part of science. It's a science, it's all scientifically explicable. So it's interesting to look at how politics and technology interact in the contemporary world. And I think, you know, a political thrust in SF is very important to have. But I wouldn't entirely not read something because it was published by Baen, for example. You know, I'd be less inclined because there's a lot of formulaic stuff. But just because something was published by Baen doesn't mean I wouldn't touch it. Of course, they publish Pohl Anderson and Robert Heinlein these days. This is another one, All Fool's Day. And I am picking up, you know, his books are not that hard to find. I wanted to get them in good nick. This has got slightly more leaning spine. That's a Chris Foss jacket, of course, as is this one. And there's a lot of Foss ones. And this was sparked by me buying one of his other books in Hay a while ago, which was in absolutely beautiful condition, like new. And I got that from Derek Adaman, who I'll mention again later on today. And I am picking up some more of these from Dorset Bob when I see him next. And me and Jules Burt are supposed to go down to see Bob, and I've really struggled to find a date to do it because I, you know, I've struggled with my health, as you know, and Christmas is coming. I've got to fit my work in, but hopefully I'll do a proper book haul with Jules and Bob before the end of December. And I'd really like to get down and see him. He's such a lovely bloke, and I haven't seen him for ages. So there we go. So that's Edmund Cooper. So I'll let you know when I get around to one of those. I might do one soon. What else do we have? Well, at the moment, I mentioned Frederick Pohl in a video the other day, and hopefully it'll be up before this one. So if it's not, I apologise. So I must make that so, because I've been shooting a lot of material. At the moment, I'm reading Gem, which I've had in Masterworks for ages and never read it. And it's one of his most highly rated novels from the late 1970s. It's got an introduction by Lisa Tuttle in this edition, and it's about a planet being discovered that has 3 forms of quite intelligent life on it, and it's about the geopolitical struggle with different missions from different factions on Earth go to this planet to try and make contact with the different alien races and see if they can start trade and what have you. And there's sort of like an Asian faction, which is China, India, Pakistan, and so on. There's a sort of Western faction, quite interesting stuff, and I'm enjoying it. And his prose, as ever, is sinewy and strong and thewed, and the characterization is deft and quick and well delineated, and the science parts are really good. And he wrote science really well, and he came out from under Cornwall's shadow in the 70s. You know, he did lots of magazine work in the 60s, a big magazine editor, and enormously long life and huge bibliography. And yeah, I'm enjoying this, but I'll let you know. I'll do a full review of it when I finished it, which I think will probably be a few days yet, because I seem to have a lot to do at the moment, as ever. Then, something else which I picked up recently, new, because I didn't know it had been reissued, is a book by a writer. I've already got this book, and I've got a little A format one. I've got an old A format one, and I've only ever flicked through it. And it's in all the reference books, and that's 7 Days in New Crete by Robert Graves. As you see, very plain livery. You're not getting the full colour here. I really like this. And I hadn't noticed that there'd been a pile of Graves reissues in Penguin Modern Classics, including his retelling of Jason and the Argonauts, The Golden Fleece is called, which I've never read, which I really want to get as well. And I thought these are beautiful. I try and buy more or less everything that Penguin issues, which is SF, in its modern classics or classics liveries. And I've had lots of them for many, many years. Some I've sold on, I must get back. And this is a utopian novel about a society which has become really stagnant because vice is kind of outlawed and everybody's too virtuous. So it's a utopian thing. And it is about somebody who has been mysteriously transported from the 20th century to this future, to New Crete, this utopian thing. And as I've said a while ago, I am thinking of doing more utopian SF on the channel because it is interesting and it's difficult. So, and I love Graves. I really love I Claudius, Claudius the God, and his retellings of the Greek myths, which have been my go-to ones since I was about, I don't know, 15. I've got the 2-volume Penguin still, and it's absolutely fantastic. You don't need Stephen Fry or Neil Gaiman, any of those lightweights, you know. You go with Graves, he's the man. So 7 Days in New Crete, elegant and beautiful. I shall let you know when I get around to it as part of my Utopia mini-season, whenever that will be. And now this is something very special. I'm going to show it again in another video coming up, and I'm delighted to get this. And this is a book which, you know, you see it for telephone numbers. This is something I've managed to get very cheaply indeed from a dealer in the States. Amazing price. I couldn't believe it. There are more of these out there than there used to be. A while ago there were only 2 on the internet, and one was £875 because it was signed by the author, and I've got lots of books signed by this author. It's never going to happen. There's another at 400, and I thought, God, box. And the thing is, this is a first thus, not a true first edition. There were 2 editions of this book before this one came out, and this is Love and Napalm, Export USA by James Graham Ballard, J.G. Ballard. And this is a beautiful little hardcover, as you see. It's got a lovely glassine wrap on it. Love and Napalm, Export USA. And this is the edition with an introduction by William Burroughs from 1972, published by Grove Press, one of the great underground publishers. And if you want to read more about Grove Press, there's a great book called Garden of Eros by John Calder, which everybody who's interested in the book should read. And it's all about Grove Press, Calder, Dial, really important publishers of the counterculture in the 50s, 60s. Girodias is in there, really great stuff. Now this was first issued in the UK as the Atrocity Exhibition, and it contains Ballard's condensed novels, some of which first appeared in New Worlds magazine. And I'll talk about the condensed novels later on, but first of all, the publishing history. And Atrocity Exhibition was published by Cape in hardcover, and in the USA it had been sold to Nelson Doubleday, and there was a moment when Doubleday himself, Doubleday Jr., was walking around the sort of pressing plant, the printing press, I should say. Pressing plant, that's of vinyl LPs, but you get the idea. And because publishers then, they'd often have their own presses as well. It was cheaper to have an in-house press if you were a big publisher. And this was rolling off the presses, and he picked it up. And there's a section in this book called Why I Want to Beep Ronald Reagan. And there's also one called You, Coma, Marilyn Monroe. And of course, Marilyn Monroe was dead by then. And Ronald Reagan wasn't at that point a presidential candidate. He became one and became president. There's another condensed novel in here called Plan for the Assassination of Jacqueline Kennedy. And of course, it was JFK, not Jacqueline, who was assassinated. So, it's pretty sort of severe stuff. And Doubleday stopped the piece, said, stop the press, pulp all of these, pulp every single copy, because he was worried about getting sued by people like Reagan. And of course, this had already happened in the UK, not the suing, the book had been published. And the title changed. I'm not sure why the title was changed. It's obviously felt, more appropriate than the Atrocity Exhibition. Very, very strange, but I like this title as well. And obviously it refers to the Vietnam War, which was still raging at that point and controversial. This was sort of like late 60s. Now this edition is 72. So it was pulled and pulped, but a certain number of copies got out of the factory. Okay? Now a few weeks ago, I was in London at the Reports on the Deep End signing. You'd have seen me there. And Rick McGrath, my editor at Deep Ends, the Ballard anthology, which I used to contribute to, which is now folded. We were talking about this in the pub, about how many copies there were, and the research I did indicated that there were 8. Now we're talking about the Doubleday one, not this Grove Press one. So only 8 copies got out. Rick said there was some evidence there could be as many as 20. Now he's got one, and this amazingly rare book. Can you imagine having one? His isn't signed because he never got Ballard to sign anything, because even though we knew him, he couldn't carry books from Canada to the UK. I'd have taken one, I think. So this was issued later as an introduction by William Burroughs, and the condensed novels are a kind of fragmented narrative of this character who's a doctor who may be undergoing a mental breakdown, and that's the theory about this. And they appeared in all sorts of places, but this is sort of like near future surrealistic stuff, and it's broken up into little paragraphs, and they have things like Dune Arabesque, Impressions of Africa, which is a Dali painting. I'll just read you a bit at random. The Assumption of the Sand Dune. This Venus of the Dunes, Virgin of the Time Slopes, rose above Talis into the meridian sky, and Talis is the name of the character, and the character's name changes. Talis, Traven, it's always with a T, but they're different aspects of the same character. This is the idea. Another bit, the apartment was a box clock, a cubicular extrapolation of the facial planes of the yantra, the cheekbones of Marilyn Monroe. The annealed walls froze all the rigid grief of the actress. He had come to this apartment in order to solve her suicide. And I think that's from You, Coma, Marilyn Monroe. Is it from that? Yes, it is. That's like a cut-in, fold-in moment, because I'm still that random, because I wrote the piece for Deep Ends called Me, Capri, Bridget, Bardot, which is a homage to that. It's about how my Italian holidays are Ballardian. Of course, you've seen the last one on the channel, and because it rained like mad, it wasn't so Ballardian. But when it's hot there, it's like Vermilion Sands, believe you me. So I was really, really pleased with that, chuffed with that. And I had to sort of do some selling. I've done a lot of selling on eBay this week to raise money, which was really, really good. I'm a bit of a clear out of vinyl LPs and things. I've got some interesting little paperbacks on at the moment. I've got a Ballard Drowned World on. It's probably gone by the time you see this, but I'm really, really pleased with that. I also got some more Fred Pohls. I'm going to show you. I've got a few Gollancz Yellow Jackets recently because that's been my jam. I've been collecting a lot of Gollancz Yellow Jackets last year, so I really love them. And I got some Fred Pohls here, and I'm just going to go through them quickly. This is Gem. I received this in the post today. I've got the paperback there. That's my reading copy. That will go once I've read it. And this is the Gollancz hardcover first. And let's see, when is this from? It's sort of late 70s. It's 1979. Very nice, I think you'd agree. Beautiful stuff. You can pick up some of these reasonably cheap. You know, it's interesting. The odd ones are expensive, and I'm not going to go full on with Pohl because there's a huge amount of them. But I am growing more interested in his work because the stuff I've read I've really enjoyed over the years. It's very little, but I'm beginning to think that rather like Silverberg, I read 4 or 5 Silverbergs in the 80s. I thought they were really good, but they never really got under my skin with the exception of Time of Changes. And I went back to him then 15 years later, begin the century, and I just fell completely in love with all his stuff, you know. So I'm thinking maybe Pohl is somebody I need to look at more as well. This is Starburst, which is another novel. I don't know much about this book, actually. I can't recall the paperback edition. And this looks like another space adventure. Oh, yeah. So this is an expansion of his novella, The Gold at the Starbow's End, which came out, let's have a look. That came out a decade before this. And that was the heading story of a collection as well. So let's see. This is 82. So he wrote Gold at the Starbow's End, 72. So this is 82. Weird, I don't remember much about this. So very plain as you see, but I do love them. They're all slightly different. They've all slightly different typography, slightly different design, and I really, really love them. They look great on the shelves. And finally, this is a book I saw at Derek Adamant's shop in Hay-on-Wye. Last time I was there a while ago, and I think I bought 6 books. I showed you the mini haul. I think most of them are from Derek, because his stuff's usually a better nick. The prices are higher. He usually gives me a discount because I'm going there a long time, and he knows I'm a bookseller. He's a good guy. He's the real deal. The last true 100% pro dealer left in Hay. And this is Polestars. So you know how to pronounce it now. You know, Polestars, as in the Pole Star. It's not Paul, it's Polestar. Pohl, Frederick Pohl, Polestar. I think we've got that right now. And science fiction stories. And this dates from, I think this is late 70s, early 80s as well. Let's see, 1986. Very, very nice. And I love looking in the back flap of these and seeing what Gollancz was doing. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read to you what they were doing in 1986. So in 1986, recent Gollancz SF. Best SF of the Year 14, edited by Terry Carr. He was shortly no longer for the world, of course. I Hope I Shall Arrive Soon, Philip K. Dick. Got that. Count Zero, William Gibson. Got that. These are all firsts I got as well. Chapter House Dune, Frank Herbert. I used to have that and got rid of it. Wish I kept it. That, interestingly, was the first ever hardcover SF book that I bought as a buyer for a bookshop. And that was in my very first bookshop. And I was like scared because I was buying a hardcover SF novel because it was a small shop. But I went for it, and I think we sold it. Man in the Tree, Damon Knight. I've got that. That's great. Great novel by Damon Knight. I blow hot and cold with Damon, as you know. Continent of Lies, James Morrow. I have read that in paperback a long time ago. Footfall by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. I've got that, but not a Gollancz. Merchant's War by Frederick Pohl, which is a sequel to Space Merchants, long time after. Haven't got that. Kite Roll by Keith Roberts. Got that. Peace Machine by Bob Shaw. I've got that. The Conglomerate Cocktail Party, Robert Silverberg. I've got that. I'm realising whenever I look in these and I look at one of these lists, I always have fewer than I think I should have, and I've got virtually everything on this list in the firsts. Slow Birds, Ian Watson, and Free Live Free by Gene Wolfe. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 13 listed there, and I've got about 10 of them, which is amazing. And you know, the completest urge that would be there, and the jewels burnt in my soul, would be to get the lot. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, I do love these. I'm really keen on them. I know some of you think they're a bore. Just looking at this one, Starburst, we have a quick run through what they're doing. And this shows you why Gollancz was so important as a hardcover publisher, because until 86, they didn't do paperbacks. They licensed all this stuff to, you know, people like Granada, Sphere, what have you. This is 82. So in 82, they were pushing Gregory Benford's Timescape, great book, No Enemy of Time, Michael Bishop, who sadly passed away recently, Terry Carr's Best SF of the Year 10, Science Fiction Hall of Fame Volume 4 by Arthur C. Clarke, editor. The Man Who Had No Idea by Thomas M. Dish, I've got that one. God Emperor of Dune by Frank Herbert. I had that. No, I've never had. That's the one Dune book I've never owned in hardcover. And I seem to remember it's got a Bruce Pennington cover, even in Gollancz. Ringwood Engineers, Larry Niven, Eye of the Queen, Philip Mann, I've got that. Interesting book. I know Moyd likes that one, doesn't he? He's keen on Philip Mann. The Cool War, Frederick Pohl. I'm looking out for a decent copy of the Cool War in a yellow jacket. The American hardcover is easy to get. It was everywhere for years, and I've got a paperback, but I would like the yellow jacket. Molly Zero, Keith Roberts, one of my favourite books of that time. Better Mantrap, Bob Shaw, got that. Lord Valentine's Castle, I don't have a hardcover of Lord Valentine's Castle. I've read it. Snail on the Slope by the Strugatsky brothers. I used to have a Gollancz yellow jacket of that, and I sold it, and it's worth a bomb now. Wish I kept it, but it's not one of my favourite ones. I've got a masterwork. It is a Strugatsky one, I would say, unless you're a complete Strugatsky brothers nut. Don't read it. I think it's a failure, really. It's clever in lots of ways and well written, but it's two books that don't quite come together. And Sunstroke and Other Stories by Ian Watson. So there you go. We may as well do the final one. Indulgent, I know. And we're heading towards the 36-minute mark. But, you know, if you don't like it, you'd have turned off by now. I'm sure many people have. So let's see. So looking at Gem, which is from the end of the 70s, 79, we get The Stars in Shroud, Gregory Benford. Haven't read it, I've got it. Blood and Burning by Argis Budrys. I've got that in this. And that is... got a sequel to Michaelmas in it, which is a great book. If you've never read Michaelmas by Argis Budrys, a really important book. Great stuff. I must do a review of that on the channel. Fountains of Paradise, Arthur C. Clarke, I've got that. That's got a pictorial dust jacket, not a yellow like this. Quite an easy book to get. Profundus, Richard Cowper, yeah, got that, read that. On Wings of Song, Thomas M. Dish. That's not a yellow one, funnily enough, it's silver. Great Dune Trilogy, Planet of Exile by Ursula Le Guin, which is the second Hainish book, the original first three Hainish books, and that would have been a reissue at this point. I'd love one of those, like Hen's Teeth. I love those books. Dream Snake, Vonda McIntyre, don't have that in the yellow, wouldn't bother. Gateway, Frederick Pohl, I've read Gateway, I'm not a fan of it, wouldn't bother with that either. Vertigo, Bob Shaw, yeah, got that. Songs of Summer, Silverberg, yeah. Prisoners of Power, Arcadian, Boris Strugatsky, now called The Inhabited Island, I've got that, and Gollancz Yellow Jacket. Great book, one of my favourite Strugatskys. And The Very Slow Time Machine by Ian Watson, which was the first Watson book I read, and it's great, really good stuff in there. Wonderful stories in there. So this is the end of this Nightfall diary. I'm going to settle down now, I think, and have something to eat, and a bit later on we'll watch something. I've got a sort of urge to watch Train Spotting, of all things, so maybe I'll watch an SF film, we'll see. And Jack will keep me company until tomorrow when the video winner comes home. Thanks for watching, hope you've enjoyed this. I know some of you think it's a bit of a filler, but I just sort of like having a slump now and again and taking it easy, you know, so you take it easy too. And Christmas is coming, we don't do the C word on this channel, there won't be a Christmas show, so forget it. But if you've got any requests, is anything you'd like to see, I really shouldn't say that because people are asking me about stuff all the time, so, you know, don't keep them to yourself, just pop them in the comments and one day I'll get to them. It's like that. Bye for now. Remember, subscribe, like, comment, super thanks, all that stuff that everybody says. And take it easy, guys. And try and have a lie-in tomorrow morning if you can. It's Sunday. I'm going to try and have a lie-in. It never works, though.